Good afternoon and welcome everyone. On behalf of SOLV and the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, I would like to welcome you to yet another high-profile event in our Commander Series. Today on the topic, Advancing the Army Priorities for the Future of Warfare. Today's event is a bit special. Usually the Commander Series welcome one senior military leader, and as you most likely have noted, we have two esteemed guests with us today. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm an executive at SOLV as well as a board director here at the Atlantic Council. When SOLV and the Atlantic Council launched this program over a decade ago, our ambition was to establish a flagship speakers forum for senior military and defense leaders to discuss current and future challenges. Over the past 12 years, this program has drawn an impressive audience across Washington's policy community, including think tanks, media, industry, embassies, and of course, US government. This program has been particularly used for defense industry in companies like SOLV, who provides capabilities to all branches of US armed forces today to better understand challenges and priorities in order for us to direct our investments, particularly when it comes to research and development, and how we can be better prepared to meet future military capability needs. Through the Commander Series, we have previously had the pleasure to host many distinguished speakers, such as General Lloyd Austin, then Commander CENTCOM, and Mark Esper, then Secretary of the Army. As you know, they both moved on to become Secretaries of Defense. It is apparently a great career move to make a guest appearance at the Commander Series. Today, we have the great pleasure of having two very distinguished guests with us. Secretary of the Army, Honorable John Whitley. Welcome and thank you for being with us today. And Chief of Staff of the Army, General James McConville, who we are welcoming back. General McConnell was our guest in January last year, and I have vivid memories on how he kicked off his presentation by pulling out an old beige rotary phone out of a plastic bag to emphasize his message. Way to make an impression, General. Very effective. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Atlantic Council President and CEO, Fred Kemp. He will make a couple of announcements and further introduce our esteemed guests. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you, Fred.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction and for your long-standing support of this series, which is one of my favorite public series of the Atlantic Council. It's certainly been one of the most consistent of them over the years. And thanks for your role on the Executive Committee of the Atlantic Council's board, Mike. I appreciate that as well. It's been a privilege to host with you the many senior defense and military leaders you've mentioned over the years, and thank you for listing some of them. I also want to echo my welcome to the incredible speakers and to, as always, a great, strong, knowledgeable audience we have with us. As Michael said, we're joined by two of the Department of Defense's most senior leaders, Acting Secretary of the Army, the Honorable John E. Whitley, and Chief of Staff of the Army, General James C. McConville. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your comments. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges of our day. The center seeks to honor my mentor, General Brent Scowcroft, and to honor his legacy of service, and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation of allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. It's very important to say all those things. General Scowcroft passed away in August, but we are here to carry on his legacy and make sure that how he understood the world lives on with us. Consistent with that mission, the Scowcroft Center's forward defense practice is designed to shape the debate around the greatest military challenges facing the United States and its allies, and creates forward-looking assessments of the trends, technologies, and the concepts that will define the future of warfare. And that brings us to our event today. It is the future we're going to be talking about today, which is so particularly important right now for the U.S. Army as we navigate a major historic inflection point in the way that great powers compete. In recent years, the Pentagon's prioritization of great power competition has driven many of the Army's robust modernization plans, but key questions remain about the ideal force structure and force posture necessary to deter China, Russia, and other revisionist actors that might arise in alignment with them. In the face of these security challenges and a potentially constrained budget environment, the Army must continue to adapt its personnel, its arsenal, and its posture to maintain an enduring advantage in the decades to come. Decisions made now will color a decade, 2 decades out from now, and that's what we'll be talking about. As the Army prepares itself for the future of competition and warfare, I couldn't be more pleased to discuss these developments with our guests today. As acting Secretary of the U.S. Army, Dr. John S. Whitley has the responsibility for all matters relating to the Army, including recruitment, organization, training, equipping, and care of the Army's active soldiers. Prior to his current role, he served as the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Financial Management and Comptroller, in addition to previous roles at the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of Secretary of Defense. In short, he knows his stuff. He is joined by the 40th Chief of Staff of the Army, General James C. McConville, as Mike said, who we had the privilege of hosting January of 2020. General McConville is responsible for organizing, training, and equipping the Army in order to prepare it for a variety of emergency contingencies and for the future of warfare. Before assuming this role, in August of 2019, General McConville most recently served as the 36th Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, in addition to previous command assignments in the 101st Airborne Division and Combined Joint Task Force 101 during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. So just a huge amount of experience and public service that we'll be listening to today. Moderating this conversation is one of my favorite journalists in town, Nancy Youssef, who serves as the national security correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, my journalistic alma mater, where I spent 25 years of my life as a correspondent and editor before joining the Atlantic Council. So Nancy, say hello to all my pals over on Connecticut and Kay. As a graduate of the University of Virginia and Georgetown University, Nancy has reported extensively on the U.S. military with a focus on Middle East affairs. Couldn't be anyone better to moderate it. But before I turn it over to our speakers for keynote remarks and then to Nancy, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to direct any questions to the panelists in the Q&A function tab, which you find at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to identify yourself with your affiliation in your questions. We will be collecting them throughout the event, and Nancy will look these over and she will pose her own questions at the end of the keynote remarks. We also encourage our online audience to join the conversation on Twitter by following @AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag #4Defense. So thank you all for joining the Atlantic Council for what I know will be a captivating conversation. Dr. Whitley, General McConville, without any more opening remarks, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for your participation in this event, and I'd like to thank the Chief in particular for not only his participation in this event, but for his lifelong service to our Army. These exchanges are always valuable to the Army. They're valuable to myself, and I assume they're valuable to the Chief as well. Not only do we get to carry the Army message forward, but we also gain valuable insights from you on key national security issues related to our Army. This past year has been an extremely dynamic and challenging year for all of us. Since becoming the acting Secretary of the Army in January, I have continued to be amazed and impressed with the state of the Army and with the professionalism, abilities, and hard work of our soldiers and leaders. From COVID-19 response, where we surged life-saving support to American hotspot cities by administering and distributing vaccines, to support to authorities in civil unrest, to defense of the Capitol, the Southwest border support, all while maintaining our operations abroad. Additionally, the Army is taking a look internally to ensure we take care of our people by addressing sexual assault and harassment, suicide, racism, and extremism. These issues harm the force. We're engaged in many actions, like our changes to command selection and institutionalizing independent reviews, standing up the People First Task Force. But we must address this at its core, which is building cohesive teams. At the Army level, we're looking at a redesign of our SHARP program, addressing how Criminal Investigation Division is structured, and rolling out recommendations from the Fort Hood Independent Review Commission. The Army remains strong because of our priorities, people, readiness, and modernization. The Army remains ready to support the interim national security guidance released by the National Security Council. The last 4 years of reform and modernization, including acquisition reform and rebuilding readiness, coupled with the ongoing efforts on people and our culture, have postured the Army well. I'll talk briefly about great power competition. The new team is continuing our focus on near-peer competition and realignment to China as a pacing threat. When people think of the Army's role in this, they recognize our central role in combat operations in the form of seizing and securing operational nodes, providing persistent defenses and actions to reestablish sovereignty. But in both Europe and the Pacific, another thing we have found is that the Army, nested with diplomacy in the State Department, can be a steadfast partner and a key to opening doors in some countries. In many of these countries, the Chief of Defense is Army. Our experience is that these countries in the Pacific know that the U.S. is a much better partner than China, but they don't want to be forced into a public choice between us and their neighbor. They still have to live in that neighborhood. What they want is a reliable partner that can engage in small, scalable ways to help build capacity over the long term. And it's this network of allies and partners across the Atlantic as well as Pacific that can stand together, train together, and ultimately operate together that is our greatest deterrence. We've talked about modernization, or modernization has already been briefly mentioned. We are at the beginning phases of the largest Army modernization effort in the last 40 years. The Army is now a DoD leader in technology and concept development and is at the forefront of fielding new technologies. Through the efforts of Army Futures Command, we have accelerated our modernization timeline by bringing the stakeholders under one roof through a soldier-centered design model. Futures Command has reduced timelines to develop requirements, as well as leverage new mid-tier acquisition authorities to aggressively prototype, test, and iterate systems before we buy. The result, we are fielding new systems and equipment now and will continue to do so over the next decade. Strategically, the systems coming online and arriving to our forces create options for the Secretary of Defense and national leadership, be it in deterrence or defense, anywhere in the globe to meet the geopolitical realities that arise. Examples of these efforts include just in FY21, Maneuver Short Range Air Defense, MSHORAD, Enhanced Night Vision Goggles. In fiscal year 2022, we'll be fielding the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, IVAS, Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle, AMP-V, and the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Battle Command System. In 23, Next Generation Rifle, Squad Automatic Weapons, Mid-Range Missiles, Precision Strike Missiles, and one of the biggest, the fielding of our first operational hypersonic battery. In FY24 to 26, the Army will begin fielding extended range cannon artillery, mobile protected firepower, and future unmanned aerial systems. These aren't far off pipe dreams. Rather, these are capabilities that will land in our formations within the next decade. I'd also like to highlight the efforts on Project Convergence. We are taking the lead and being the first in the battlefield to sense, make sense, and decide. This speed and decision-making, underpinned by AI in the cloud, will create an advantage in the lethality and survivability for our force. These efforts will drive solutions to a wide array of problems. Final to this effort is our acquisition reforms. Our soldier-centered design model brings end users in early. As such, we're able to increase our ability to research, create, and field solutions to our most pressing issues. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the budget. The Army needs consistent budget support to survive. Several years ago, the Army identified the need to modernize to maintain combat capability in the face of near-peer adversaries. To this end, the Army established night courts and reprioritized its own funding in order to invest in science and technology and set a path to modernization. We also rebuilt Readiness during this time frame from the decline brought on by sequester. What we learned, however, is that Readiness can decline rapidly and must be consistently funded. And a ready and well-trained Army is better experimenting with new concepts and quickly integrating new capabilities so that we can take on the most complicated national security threats. Undoubtedly, consistent, sustained, and predictable funding is necessary for maintaining readiness and continuing our progress in modernization. We rely on and appreciate the interactions with professionals like yourselves to ensure we understand our most difficult challenges from multiple perspectives. Thank you for allowing me to make these opening remarks, and I look forward to our discussion.
And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those remarks and also for your leadership over these last couple of months and really over the last couple of years. And you know, as you said in the open, Michael, is you know, it's been a little over a year since I had a chance to talk to you, and I was just thinking about, you know, since January of last year, what the Army's been through, and it's been an incredible challenging year when you think about, you know, where we were with Iran in January, and then with COVID coming in, and as we realized in the Army, we could not telecommute to training, and we couldn't telecommute to combat, and so all our troops and leaders had to work their way through that while we stood up the Army in many ways to go ahead and combat this virus that was taking so many of the American people. And then we saw social unrest, we saw national disasters, we saw continued global operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and around the world. And we saw ourselves supporting in the national capital region. So from where I stand, I couldn't be more proud of our soldiers, of how they have weathered this virus, how they've weathered these challenges, and very pleased about their overall performance and the support of their families. And as the Secretary said, we are in posture season. You know, we are waiting for the budget to come out, and you know, we can have a discussion. But you know, there's really three things that we play with, the levers, as we like to call them. It's end strength and structure, it's readiness, and it's modernization. And those are the type of decisions that have to be made at each service based on the guidance that we receive. And you know, the Army today sits about the same size it did at 9/11, about 485,000 active soldiers, and just over 1 million soldiers with the reserve and the Guard, same size as 9/11. We've rebuilt the readiness. The Army, after 3 or 4 years of steady funding, is ready to fight and win tonight. And you know, the key consideration that the Secretary stressed is, you know, we are at that time, we're at an inflection point, as you described, in great power competition, taking a force that spent the last 20 years conducting irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism operations primarily, and moving to great power competition. And I like to say great power competition doesn't have to mean great power conflict, and quite frankly, it can't be. And the way we avoid that is through strength. It's peace through strength. It's having a strong whole government effort. It's having a strong military, and it's having a strong Army with strong allies and partners. And we are committed to that. And as the Secretary said, we are undertaking the largest transformation of the Army in 40 years. And I argue we do that every 40 years or so. We did in 1940, right before World War II, when General Marshall sat in the chair that I'm fortunate enough to occupy. We did in 1980 when I came into the Army, and we're at the time where we need to transform the Army. And transform the Army is not just getting new equipment. If we go back to the 1980s, it was new doctrine with airland battle. It was new organizations with Ranger Battalions, Special Mission Units, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, along with others. It was new training methods, and that's when we actually stood up the national training centers that our troops are able to practice and rehearse so well. it was the big five, which we still use today: the Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Patriot missile system, the Apache, and the Black Hawk, and we incrementally improved them. And one of the most important things that happened in the 70s into the 80s was the all-volunteer force. We take that for granted today, those of us in the Army work every day to make sure the American people trust us. So they'll send their sons and daughters, and they'll volunteer to serve. And I would argue that's why we have the best non-commissioned officer corps in the world, is because we have an all-volunteer force. So as we move into the transformation, we're standing up new doctrine. It's a joint all-domain operations, of which our contribution is multi-domain operations. We're standing up a system that we're working very closely with our sister services and our allies and partners with a combined joint all-domain command and control system, so we can pass data very, very quickly between each of our weapon systems and have the overmatch that gives us. We're in the process of standing up new organizations. The multi-domain task force will provide precision effects and also precision long-range fires. And we've stood up security force assistance brigades that help us in the competition phase, building the capacity and capability of our allies and partners. And we're standing up organizations to help us deal with the information environment that's so important in today's competition. In training, we're taking advantage of the technology where before we had what we call DIRT combat training centers. We're standing up synthetic training centers where we can train in virtual and augmented reality. And our modernization priorities are the big six, with long-range precision fires, a next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. And within those major items, there's 31 plus 4 weapon systems that we're developing. And probably most important is we're moving from an industrial age personnel management system to a 21st century talent management system that's going to give us the capability to compete for the talents of the young men and women today. And we don't build these soldiers overnight. We want to bring them in. We spend an extensive amount of time training them, and we want them to stay, and we're going to compete for their talents by managing them by their knowledge, skills, and behavior. We've set up a new program to assess leaders, and we're putting a new system in, an integrated personnel and pay system that allow us to manage all three components in a much different way than we ever did before. So those are the open comments I have, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fred, for that very kind introduction. General McConville, Secretary Whitley, it's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation. I want to start with you, Secretary Whitley. You talked a lot about the modernization strategy, and you outlined some of the sort of targets that you see in the next few years. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the adjustments that you've had to make as an Army since first introducing the strategy, and will we see more adjustments as there are limitations in terms of the budget? And do you see an ability to focus more on modernization with the withdrawal happening in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so a couple of pieces. I think you were talking there specifically about the prioritization of people as our first priority and those effects.
I meant more the technology, the modernization, the equipment, and how you're able to focus on that, given some of the budget constraints, given but at the same time the opening that perhaps the withdrawal from Afghanistan offers, and what we've learned, what you've learned in the last 2 years about.
Okay, no, I've got you now. So I'm with you. So thank you. Very nice to see you again, and thank you. So with modernization, the budget plays into that, and the chief actually kind of alluded to this a little bit. When you look at the levers you have your readiness in your current operations, you have end strength, and you have modernization. What we've primarily tried to do right now is fund that modernization as much as possible through prioritization. And really, what we called our night court process, where we went through and we combed through every line item of the budget and looked for things that we could either reduce or cut or eliminate. And these were not things that were unimportant. These were all valuable things that the Army was doing, but they were what we believed were these were less important than modernization. We've realigned over the last 3 budget cycles, 20 to 24, 21 to 25, and 22 to 26. We've realigned over $30 billion towards modernization. We like to talk about our 31 plus 4 signature programs, and the folks who are deeply versed in the Army's budget and the Army's modernization plan will know what those are. And we've been trying to, 1, protect those, and 2, grow those and fund those through the RDT&E phase and then into the procurement phase. And our intent and our plan is to continue doing that. As the budget gets tighter, that becomes harder to do. And what we've done up till this point to fund this is we've realigned those resources, like I said, through the night court process. We get into hard decisions that have to be made to continue that. We have additional procurement programs where we're buying legacy equipment, or upgraded variants of legacy equipment to field and to keep the force today up with the most up-to-date equipment as possible. And we've slowed that in many places, and we'll continue to have to make hard choices there as we slow that. We've looked at readiness. We do not want to take risk against readiness. We've made that as a corporate decision. We've looked at things we can do within readiness, and the chief has talked about this in other forums very articulately. There are places where we might be able to do a little bit of readiness more efficiently by looking at smaller unit training and looking at and focusing a little bit more than we have in the past at the squad, platoon, company, battalion level. So there might be little bits that we can save there, but we're going to continue to prioritize readiness and not take significant risks there. The other area is operations, and it's a simple fact that the Army is very, very busy. Everybody knows how busy we've been over the last 20 years in the Middle East, but that's not the only thing, and withdrawals there don't necessarily free up as much as we would like. The past year plus has actually been domestic requirements, from COVID to the Southwest border to the Capitol DC security, etc. So we will be looking at operations and what places where we can take risks, places where we can try to reduce the demand on the Army there. You specifically asked about the changes in Afghanistan, the changes in the Middle East. That there's a couple of things to say there. First is, if the plan goes as planned, as we all hope it will, yes, there will be some freeing of resources. Now that freeing of resources, the Army's position would be, that'd be nice if that stayed with the Army. That probably won't be the department's position. So how much of that becomes available to the Army will be a decision made by the leadership at the Office of Secretary of Defense level. But the second point to make is, there's a lot of risk. You don't know exactly how this will play out. And we've done these before. We did the withdrawal from Iraq. We've done other changes. And what we found is the follow-on costs generally tend to be higher than what was expected. So we have a plan right now. We have an expectation, which we'll talk about when we roll out the 22 budget, of what we think the requirements will be in FY22 for that. And if that is realized, then that will be great. But we also know that there's risk associated with that. And what we do in the follow-on activities could come out to be more than that, in which case there'll be a shortfall. Or although we haven't seen this one as often, obviously they could come out lower, in which case there'd be a surplus there. But we've made an estimate. The leadership of the department has made an estimate of what we think the requirements will be. And we'll be able to talk about that when the 22 budget comes out.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the Atlantic Council has some of the most thoughtful audience members, and they've already given some great questions. So I hope you'll indulge me if I pose some of them to you gentlemen as they're coming in, rather than wait to the end exclusively. General McConnell, I'd like to pose one of those questions to you from Sydney Friedberg from Breaking Defense, who asks, what level of end strength cuts do you think the Army needs to accept in order to preserve that modernization in this coming budget environment?
Yeah, I think right now on end strength is, like I said, the Army is at 485,000 active, a little around 1 million. And, what will determine what the final end strength is how much risk, the department is willing to take and what the strategy is requiring that end strength. From where I sit right now, I think 485,000 active, a little over 1 million for total force is the what we're looking at with what we see as the present strategy, and that's the same size Army we had before 9/11, and that could change depending on the priorities, and that could change based on the resourcing. And as people make those tough decisions, we will be taking a look at it. But right now, what we've done, at least the Secretary and I have agreed to, is we're not going to grow the Army above 485,000-ish with the resources that we're anticipating now.
Is there a dangerously low number that you've sort of warned against as you're talking to On the Hill?
No, not exactly the number. I just think that, if you want to anchor a number and have a number that most people are familiar with, it's 485,000. That's the 9/11 number, and on the reserves a little over 500,000. So it's about a million person force, and then you get an idea of what that force can do. We had to grow the Army during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. We grew the active Army up to about 570,000, and with the Guard and Reserve at the peak, we had 720,000 soldiers on active duty. So that's kind of the way to anchor and take a look at what size force you need. But that'll be driven by resources, and it'll be driven by how much risk the department's willing to take on end strength.
And I'd add to that, Nancy, if I can. I'd reinforce what the chief said. The Army, the United States Army is fully committed today between our operational demands from current operations, between the O-plan demands, the operation plans demands that are placed on us in the event of a war. The Army is fully committed. So, it becomes a conversation of, what requirements are going to be relieved on us, what requirements are going to be lifted from us. And that's not a conversation that we can have in the Army unilaterally. We have to talk to our leadership in the Office of Secretary of Defense and say, where is it that we are going to get relief from requirements to have those kinds of conversations? So, we don't set our end strength in a vacuum. We set it based on the requirements we're given. And as General McConville said, the requirements right now exceed the end strength that we currently have.
I wanted to go to another area that the Army's made its priority, which is people first, and talk to you a little bit about that. And I'll start with you, General McConville, if I may. I wondered if you could give a sense in terms of how the people first priority has changed the way the force thinks about how to operate, prepare for future threats.
Yeah, I think it began with a philosophy. When we came in as the chief of staff of the Army, I had the privilege of being the vice before, and at that time our number one priority was readiness, and we really got the Army ready after about 3 years of work that we needed to do. So we also took a look around the Army and just looked at the op tempo. We've been in conflict for 20 years, and you look at some of our leaders. Take a look at General Miller. Take a look at General LaCamera. Some of these incredible combat leaders, how much they've been deployed. We have sergeants with multiple combat tours, multiple rotations. And, as we took a look at where the Army was, the philosophy became, hey, people first. Because a lot of times in the Army, it's mission first, people always. And, with the philosophy was the idea, not only taking care of the troops and building these cohesive units where we take care of everyone and treat everyone with due respect, but how do we compete for talent in the future? We're in a war for talent. We want to keep the best and brightest in the military as we go through this inflection point. And what happened was we started taking a look at it, and we actually made it the number one priority. And what the number one priority did was it starts to get into where the resources go. We took a look at the quality of life benefits that we wanted to provide soldiers. So like housing, we had a problem with housing. So we put a bunch of money into housing. We're very concerned about healthcare, as we put, we've been working to make sure the healthcare is good. Child development centers, 89% of our sergeants and above have families, and there's a lot of dual working couples. So if we want them to stay in the Army, we have to provide quality child development centers, and then spousal employment. So and then the move. So we took a look at some of the things that we needed to do, and we put them in the priorities. But the other thing is we're moving to a 21st century talent management system where we take a look at the soldiers' knowledge, skills, behaviors. We added a P, preferences, like where do you want to go and what you want to do, which is kind of blasphemous in the Army, the idea, you get a preference. And that doesn't mean you always get your preference, but if we can give it to you and it fits the needs of the Army, why not? And what we're finding is that by putting people first and taking care of people and building organizations that are cohesive teams where everyone treats everyone with due respect, we also get after some of these harmful behaviors like the Secretary talked about: sexual harassment, sexual assault, extremism, and racism. We want to be the organization that just doesn't have those, that doesn't have menace. And we want to be the organization where the American people have not only trust, but complete trust. And they want to send their sons and daughters to serve in the Army because it's a great place to have a future and to get ahead in life. And that's what this is all about. And it gets back to people are our greatest strength, and it's our most important weapon system. And we're going to invest in people first.
Secretary Whitley.
I just add to what General McConville just said. Making people first in our priority really cuts across the entire Army. When I first came to the Pentagon almost 20 years ago, one of the first things and began working across with all the services is one of the first things I noticed was a difference between us and our sister services and our partners is they oftentimes talk about manning the equipment. For the United States Army, it's equipping the man. We think about people first, and then we think about what equipment we're going to give them, what training we're going to give them, and then we think about how we're going to go to war. So, so I talked about readiness a few minutes ago when we were talking about the budget, and I talked about maybe a little bit of reweighting towards smaller unit training. That's about getting individual soldiers the skills that they need and that they require to be ready to go to war. General McConville is the Army's biggest proponent and biggest expert on talent management, and we've already mentioned briefly, and he can talk in much more detail about how we've changed command selection and getting the right leaders into place, not only so that they can address the people issues that we've been talking about, but so that they can deliver the cohesive teams and readiness that we need to be able to fight and win our wars. In modernization, I mentioned it, and it's been mentioned many times, how we fundamentally changed the requirements determination and acquisition process. That includes the idea of going to industry with problem statements and with questions as opposed to going with requirements. But what it also includes is this embedding of soldier touch points from the very earliest stages all the way along. So we have industry partners working with soldiers right out of the gate on trying to determine how we solve certain problems, and then trying to turn those solutions into developmental programs and ultimately procurement programs. Units, how we structure our units and the experiments we're doing with SFABs and with multi-domain task forces. All of these things are about people. All of these things are about getting the right people in the right place with the right skill set, with the right training, with the right equipment, so that they can be the modernized, ready Army that we need to meet near-peer adversaries.
I want to address an issue that both of you brought up and has been very prominently discussed at the Pentagon recently, which is sexual harassment and assault. As you know, the Secretary has made it a priority, and there's an independent review commission that is expected to propose taking those cases out of commanders' hands. And the services will be asked to concur or non-concur on that. General Milley has said he's on board. I'm curious from both of you how you're thinking about that issue. And do you think that is the best way to proceed for the Army? Or do you think that there is something we, the public, are thinking about in terms of the unintended consequences of taking those decisions and the prosecution of those cases out of commanders' hands?
Why don't you lead off, General McConville, and I'll provide some thoughts at the end.
I think, and I've talked to the chairman about this. I think everyone is concerned about sexual harassment, sexual assault in the Army, in the military. We tragically lost Vanessa Guillen, which quite frankly broke my heart. I talked to her mother, at the memorial service. And what I told her, I made a pledge to her that we would put in place procedures that would help make this better. And so there's the independent review, there's legislation being proposed, and I think we're open-minded to see how that's going to proceed. We're doing a whole bunch of things in the Army right now as part of our People First Task Force to get after those issues, how we build cohesive teams, how we take advantage of the assessment programs that we have for battalion command, brigade command, sergeant major, and first sergeant, and making sure that commanders are setting the right climate and culture in their organizations to prevent sexual harassment, sexual assault, along with extremism and racism, and prevent suicides, those harmful behaviors. And we're also have a program going, This Is My Squad, that gets down to, quite frankly, the level where these type things happen, the 17 to 24-year-olds that come into the Army. We bring about 120,000 of those soldiers in every single year into the Army every year. And we need to make sure that they know what our values are, they know what their standards are, and do that. And so we have multiple things going on, from restructuring the SHARP program to restructuring CID to get after those type things. And so what we're going to do is we'll take a look at those, at the legislation or the recommendations that are being proposed, and come back with a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. And my going in position is I trust commanders to do the right thing the right way. We just want to make sure whatever commanders are making those recommendations or making those decisions, or whether it's independent prosecutors, they have the right expertise and they have the authorities and responsibility placed in the right place.
I just add to what General McConville said, and as you laid out the process, Nancy, the Secretary received his briefing on the Independent Review Commission recommendations. He then turned and asked the Chief and I to take that briefing and then to provide him, our feedback, our reactions and position on that. So we have received the briefing. We're in the process of developing, our response, what our position will be, and reviewing it. We've asked Independent Review Commission for what analysis they've done. We see the briefing on their recommendations. For us, it's really going to come down to, what the analysis says. What will this do? Will this move the needle in a positive direction on sexual assault? Will this move the needle in a negative direction on sexual assault? We need to understand that. We need to understand what analysis they did to understand what the likely impacts of their proposal would be. We're doing our own analysis. We're trying to understand the data better. What do we know about sexual assaults in the Army? What do we know about sexual assaults in broader society? What do we know about the relative magnitudes of the problem and the drivers of the problem? So we're asking a lot of questions right now, trying to understand the underlying data and the analysis that supports or that was done by the Independent Review Commission to develop their results. And so when we get that from them, that'll help us form our views, and then we'll be providing our response back to the Secretary.
I want to ask you about China and where the Army sort of sees its place in terms of combating China. I was wondering if you could help our audience get a sense when we all think about the role of the Army vis-a-vis China, should we think about it in an active way or in more in putting the Army in other places like Europe to combat other threats, so that other services like the Navy and the Air Force can focus that? Where do you see the Army as the U.S. combats threats from China? I pose that to both of you.
Well, I'll lead off, and then I'll turn it over to General McConville, who's got a tremendous amount of experience on this exact question. I'll say for the Army, from a policy perspective, the Army would like to be given the choice of which theater do you want to work on, and then and you can take a break in the others. Unfortunately, we're not going to be given that choice. So the Army is going to be part of the solution, both in the Indo-Pacific and in other theaters. I mean, where I think you were going there a little bit is it is hard to think about something that might, if something were to go wrong in the Pacific, that there would not be opportunistic behavior elsewhere in the globe, and vice versa. If something were to happen in Europe, that there wouldn't be opportunistic behavior in China. So the two are interrelated. Within the Pacific, what I've learned in the last 3.5 months is really kind of the importance of the Army and the role the Army plays across the spectrum, from competition and trying to create deterrence all the way up through to conflict. So I said briefly in my opening remarks, I talked about how the Army is engaging across the region and how we found kind of good synergies and partnerships. And you look at Indonesia. We're talking to Indonesia. They want to build a combat training center, and we've been talking to them about that and how we might be able to assist them. We have ongoing engagements in Thailand that people are familiar with strikers, and we have Vietnam. We have warehouses for humanitarian assistance and our engagement on cold weather gear, on artillery and other forms of assistance in India have been very promising over the last year or so. So when you think about what, as I said in my opening remarks, when you think about what our partners and our potential partners in the Pacific are looking for, they're not looking for either or questions that force them to publicly declare an allegiance to us over the neighbor that they have to continue to live next to. What they want are kind of scalable. What we observe that they want are kind of scalable, incremental partnership and capacity building relationships. And what you do over time is you invest in that, and that starts to give you the access, the types of authorities for basing and overflight and other types of things that you might need to partner with them in the event that something were to go catastrophically wrong and our deterrence was unsuccessful and we were to end up in a kinetic engagement in the region. And if we do end up in a kinetic engagement in the region, it's going to be all domain. There's going to be a component, there's going to be a ground force component, there's going to be an air component, there's going to be an air naval component, there's going to be space activity, there's going to be cyber activity. We can wish that it wouldn't be so, but the fact of the matter is it will be an all-domain conflict, and so we're all going to have to contribute to the joint force, and we're going to have to make that work. And that if that horrible event arises, General McConville.
Thank you. I just think I talked a little about peace through strength, and we want peace in the Indo-Pacific. We want a free and open Indo-Pacific, and there's many other countries out there that share the same goals, the same values. And our strength comes from we're going to provide options to the combatant commanders, whether it's a multi-domain task force, security force assistance brigades, air and missile defense, or the type of organizations that they need so they can do their mission. And then on the other side of the house, as the secretary talked about, we have a lot of friends and allies out in the Indo-Pacific. They don't necessarily want to choose between us and others, but at the same time, we can work very closely with them. We share interests with them, and helping them build their capacities and capabilities is how you get to that strength. And that strength leads to deterrence and also leads to peace in the region.
I want to ask you one more question, then give you some of the fabulous questions from the audience. I've hosted to you, General McConville. I know that we're in the midst of talking about the future U.S. support for Afghan security forces and what that U.S. support could look like, including where U.S. troops could be based. I was wondering if you could give me a sense of sort of what scenarios you could see in which U.S. ground forces would re-enter Afghanistan. Are there scenarios that you're thinking about where that would be a possible option?
We're not proposing that right now. Certainly, from the Army standpoint, those type questions would be best to go to General Frank McKenzie or General Miller, because they're actually, what we're going to do is provide the trained, disciplined, and fit troops that will, conduct those type operations. And we're certainly prepared to provide whatever forces they need to. But like any plan, there's always branches and sequels. If things don't go the way they thought they were, and usually plans don't go the way you think are, there's definitely plans to do that. And the Army will be ready to provide whatever forces they need to do to accomplish the mission.
Well, I have a number of great questions from the audience, and so I'd like to pose some of those to you, if I may. Secretary Whitley, I'd like to start with you. This is a question from Mike Board with WOAI News, and he asks, what constitutes a digital or a cyber act of war, particularly in light of the recent events, such as the cyber attacks on the Colonial Pipeline?
I mean, a digital or cyber what? I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
I beg your pardon. He asked, what constitutes a digital or a cyber act of war?
Oh, well, when I have the answer to that one, I'll definitely publish it, and I'll try to profit from it. I mean, that's one of the hardest questions we're facing, right? I mean, this is the whole idea of gray zone conflict. And, you know, we know, I mean, we're attacked every day right now, as I think the question alluded to and provided an example. We're being attacked every day in the cyber domain. We're trying to understand, one, how to defend ourselves better. And we're trying to understand, two, what's the scope and what types of offensive operations can we undertake during this gray zone period. We're in and this isn't the Army. I mean, the Army is to General McConnell's answer to the last question. The Army as a force provider is the somewhat downstream of this question, but the department as a whole, Cybercom as a whole, the department, Office of Policy as a whole is trying to figure out what the answer to that question is. So I don't know the answer. I know that we are under attack in ways that if they were kinetic, they'd be considered pretty significant. They are very significant in the cyber domain. We're trying to understand what that means, how we characterize those, how we describe those to the public, how we, what types of reactions and what types of counter move are justified and can be defended, given the level of those attacks. And we're trying to figure out what we can do in the offensive space that's appropriate, consistent with our values, and promotes long-term peace and doesn't end up doing more harm than good. So that was a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer to the question, but it's one of the biggest questions facing us today.
Sometimes I don't know is my favorite answer because it's an honest one, so I appreciate it. General McConnell, I'd like to pose a question to you from Byron Callan of Capital Alpha Partners, who asks, we often focus on the Indo-Pacific, but can you speak to some of the operating challenges the Army is facing in other parts of the world, urban domains, infrastructure in Eastern Europe, the Arctic, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's we're a not a Pacific Theater Army, general purpose Army, and up in the Arctic right now, we've put out a new strategy, and we're taking a look at how we actually operate up there. Historically, we've been in Alaska, but Alaska's kind of been a basing type operations. We have a Stryker brigade up there, but that's not really designed to operate in the coldest of winters, and we tend to deploy out of there. So we're training our troops in getting the right equipment so they can operate all the time in that environment. But we also have to operate around the world. So some of the systems that we're developing, you'll see speed and range and convergence becoming very, very important. If you're operating in Africa, if you're operating in South America, all of a sudden, the ability to operate from a base, the more speed you have in an aircraft, the more range you have, just gives you that much more capability. And again, we're in 140 countries right now around the world, and we need to have those capabilities so we can work with our allies and partners, and basically with a global capability to maintain the world order that we all enjoy today.
I have a question from Major Daniel Littrell, who's U.S. Army Olmsted Scholar. And he asks, what is the U.S. Army's role in a Taiwan contingency? And he asked if you could elaborate a little bit more on how the Army is working with the Navy and other services to be prepared to participate in a primarily naval or cyber or space conflict with China. If you could kind of walk us through some of those joint efforts.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go into the Taiwan. I appreciate I can talk to him offline in another venue, but I think when we take a look at what type of capabilities that the Army provides, we certainly have a security force assistance brigade, so we can help a country with its capacities and capabilities. We provide air and missile defense capabilities, provide multi-domain task force capabilities, long-range precision fires. We're developing the capabilities to have land-based anti-ship missile capability. We have a vast amount of capabilities in cyber and information operations and electronic warfare and space support. So there's a lot of things the Army can do and a lot of things the Army brings to the table. And as far as specifically with Taiwan and some other places, probably not the right venue to get into the absolute specifics, but the Army will provide the right capabilities that any of our combatant commanders need to do to get the job done.
Well, I'd love to end where we began, which is both of you talked about how much threats and the demands of the Army have changed just in the last year. And so I'm curious from both of you, as we think in the next 6 months or year, what are threats that perhaps we're not thinking about, that you're thinking about, that a year from now we might be saying, just a year ago, we weren't even thinking about X threat, but now it's something we really need to think about. I'm curious how both of you think it's 6 months and a year from now, we'll be thinking about these issues.
You want to start off, Chief?
I was going to let you go first, Secretary.
Well, I was going to say, obviously probably the biggest one on our mind is Afghanistan, right? And that, as the Chief said, not in the context of us going back in, but in the context of, what happens as we come out. What does the over the horizon remain look like? What does defense of any assets that remain in theater, like an embassy, what does that entail? And then, how does that evolve and what changes? As it, we're the commanders on the ground are doing a tremendous job of trying to plan that and trying to do this as professionally and safely and responsibly as we can. We know, though, that the plans aren't going to be perfect and that the world will interfere with those plans. So what's that going to mean? And then what's that going to mean from an operational perspective? What's that going to mean from a budgetary perspective, et cetera? So that, number one on the list is the Middle East. And as much as we're trying to pivot and focus elsewhere, certainly the Middle East remains our biggest point of engagement, certainly in a combat situation. And then you can look around the rest of the globe and you think about Europe. We're all aware of what's been happening in Ukraine and on the Ukrainian border with Russian forces. So, we're constantly on the lookout for that. And what would be the next situation that could arise there? Is it in south in the Crimea? Is it up on the north side? And what are the objectives there? And what types of things might we see next? So we're constantly thinking about those types of things. I don't know the answers, but we're constantly trying to understand what might happen and what might happen elsewhere in Europe. As you look across and you go north from there and east from there, what might happen in different places across Europe. And then in the Pacific, we've talked about, what we're trying to do there and build, working very hard and I think with some success, building, kind of stable, scalable, enduring engagements there. But we know there's challenges there. That those challenges keep flaring up. There's disputes over islands with Japan. There's disputes over islands with China. There's land border issues with India. There has been in the past land border issues with Vietnam. There's Hong Kong, which has been at times a very tense situation. There's the peninsula and there's Taiwan. So the list of what could happen in the next year is quite long. And so that gets back to our very earliest conversation then about the budget and what we have to be prepared for and the importance of maintaining readiness while at the same time modernizing our forces. So I can't give you the top three from that list. I don't know what the top three would be, but the list is quite long and it creates significant challenges that our men and women in uniform deal with so admirably every time they get faced with one.
And I agree with the secretary. And the only thing I would add is I don't think anyone knows, and those who think they know, history will probably say they don't. So all those things that the secretary laid out, we take a look at why we ended up in Afghanistan was because violent extremists. We take a look at how we ended up, in other places. We're concerned about weapons of mass destruction, whether there or whatever. So there's a lot of reasons why there's can be threats out there, but there's other places where that can happen. We know who our great power competitors are. We know that is an endless competition. It's going to go back and forth. And I think from where we sit, as an Army and a military is, what we want to do is provide the best Army we can provide. That is a general purpose Army that can range the spectrum from counterinsurgency, actually more, from the competition phase into a deterrence phase and crisis phase to a conflict. And it really runs the gamut of, low technology, insurgents to large scale ground combat operations. Again, getting back to my point is, the stronger we are, the stronger we are as a force, and the stronger we are with allies and partners, the better chance we have of making the cost so much that no one's going to want to engage in conflict with us. And I think that's what we want to do.
You both have been very generous with your time, and I appreciate the candor in your answers, and that we could tackle so many issues in such a short period of time. So I just want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for a great conversation and to our audience as well for your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all who participated.
And thank you, Nancy. Really appreciate spending time with you.
Likewise.